Rightio, so today we're looking at propagation of ornamentals. So just a few objectives of the talk. The question probably should be asking yourselves is, should you actually be propagating? Is it more efficient to buy in young plants? And that's something we'll try and tease out as we go through the webinar. Sources of propagation material, storage and preparation of that material, when you really need to use rooting hormones, and an outline of key methods and systems. So to propagate or not, just looking at some of the pros of in-house propagation using your own material. You've generally got less risk of pest disease and weeds being brought into the nursery. You know what any pest disease, weed pressure you have on site, and hopefully you can address those before you get to the propagation phase. So if there's any stock with a virus or something like leaf and bud nematode, it's wise to avoid propagation from that to save proliferation of problems. Also, I've had instances of nurseries buying in young plants that have actually brought in things like tomato spotted wilt virus, which can be quite tricky to spot on some hosts. The symptoms vary between hosts, and it certainly created a challenge for them in eradicating that virus from their production once it became established, because it spread by insects. So vectors such as western flower thrips spread that virus. So they believe it came in on some bought-in stock and then spread into their own production, and did result in them incurring quite a lot of wastage. And then we're all aware of the problems of notifiable diseases such as Xylella, and there's always a risk of bringing that in from imported stock, though there are methods in place to minimise that risk. Propagation in-house is normally cheaper where you've got the skills and facilities available, and it can give security of supply, and you should be confident that your material is true to type, whereas in some areas of a trade there are mixes within batches of stock. So depending on how you're sourcing propagation or new material for propagation, that might become an issue. The industry's changed quite a bit in recent years, and the range of plants offered by the majority of growers has been streamlined. So if you are propagating something that's a bit niche, you might not be able to buy that in, and that unusual niche line may give you sort of a competitive advantage. So if that's the case, that's definitely a reason to continue propagating in-house. So looking at some of the cons of in-house propagation, it can be time consuming, conflicting with other important tasks associated with production, so potting, cultural tasks such as pruning, any pest disease, weed control, and in some cases even marketing. So this is normally more of an issue for smaller growers who are sort of trying to spread themselves thinly at busy times of year and wear many hats, as it were.
Sorry, David, can we just pause there? Are people struggling to see the presentation? I think we've got some messages in the chat saying that the presentation's not showing on the screen.
Okay, right.
It's showing just a blank screen, so it's sharing something, just not the presentation.
Strange.
If you have an issue, I can always share it from my side.
Yeah, if you can share it from your side, because I don't quite know why that's happening.
Yeah, no, that's no problem. Just bear with me 1 second. Just bear with me 1 second. It's
Apologies, everybody. This is the first time that we have actually had a technical glitch on the presentation. It must be the new year.
David, if you stop sharing your screen, then mine should kick in then. Bear with me 1 second. It's coming up now, it's just loading.
Great.
There we go. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Can everybody else see that as well?
I was on about the third slide.
Okay. Let me see if I can.
Yeah.
That the one?
And the next one.
Next one. Okay.
If I just say next slide when I want to move on, that'd be great.
Yeah, no problem.
So back to where we were. Sorry about that glitch, folks. So some of the cons of propagation: it can tie up quite a lot of space, particularly on smaller nurseries, and resources in terms of material, growing media, staff time, etc. And in some cases can give a lack of flexibility. Certainly this year we've seen the market changed due to COVID-19, and some people have had quite poor years and other people have had very good years, depending on where they were in the marketplace and particularly how they were selling their stock. And those that were buying in young plants were relatively fleet of foot and could really react to the market and get as much stock through as was possible, although there were shortages in the supply chain. So that's another consideration. Stock plants need to be managed, and there's various ways of doing this. There's sort of a traditional stock bed type approach for hardy nursery stock, but these are costly and people have acknowledged that, and for quite a number of years people have tended to minimize their sort of formal stock beds, as it were, and then focus on propagating from container plants on the nursery. But that creates other challenges because sometimes there are conflicts with sales departments, and you really need to be on the ball because you don't want to find that all your propagation materials being sold and you've got nothing to propagate from, particularly if it's something that's difficult to obtain or more unusual. So it needs careful management. Also, specialist propagators supplying young plant material at a pre-agreed specification for a certain week number can really aid in the scheduling of marketable crops and also in the utilisation of space within the nursery. So that's another consideration. So it really depends on the nursery, your types of crops you're producing, and where you are in the marketplace as to whether you propagate or not. And many of them, particularly of the big nurseries, do a mix of both. They propagate some and buy some in, and that seems to work well for them. Okay, next slide. So moving on to harvesting cuttings. So hygiene must start here, and mustn't forget hygiene is a key factor in the health of these young plants that we're going to spend time and effort getting them to root. So using clean white polythene bags to collect material in the height of summer. These are useful because they reflect heat compared to a black bin bag which absorbs heat, so helps keep the cuttings as cool as we can. Other times it may be appropriate to use damp Hessian sacks, again what works for you. And avoiding the heat, it can be done by collecting in the morning on warm days to avoid that heat stress on those cuttings and minimize any water stress, because that's all going to reduce the rootability of those cuttings. As soon as possible after collection, if you can dampen the cuttings within the bag, that again reduces any heat stress, helps maintain them their turgor, and keeps them fresh and in a good state for rootability. You don't want to get them too wet because that can result in them heating up like a bag of grass clippings does. So just a bit of moisture to refresh them, as it were. And labelling them with the variety and cultivar of a permanent pen, because once they're removed from the mother plant, it can be difficult to remember what they are, particularly if you're doing various different varieties of, say, viburnum tinus. So they all look fairly similar. Okay, next slide. So storage of our cuttings. Main focus with softwood cuttings is they can deteriorate very rapidly in the summer, and our key focus needs to be minimizing any water loss from them, because that will impact on their rooting potential. So we're aiming to handle those as quickly as possible, keep them cool and shaded. You can utilize cold storage, temperature shown there, to remove field heat. So field heat is the heat of the cuttings when they're collected, if you're not familiar with that term. And if it's not removed sufficiently, it will generate more heat as they start to heat up, and that will damage them. So we don't want that to happen. And on a small scale, a large domestic fridge can be used for this sort of task. And just from a management point of view, most species can be cold stored for several days. So if you do need to collect in advance of propagation, maybe if there's a real heat wave coming, you might want to get your material collected before they're exposed to that heat to minimize the stress. Well, that's a good reason for storing them for several days and getting them in a good place before you need to propagate them. Okay, next slide. So preparation and inserting cuttings. The worktops need to be regularly disinfected, at least between batches, and certainly at the end of every day. It just maintains good hygiene and stops any problems developing. The staff seats should be adjustable, and typically wheel type seats are used because that allows a little bit of movement to get trays, etc., which should all be easy to access for ergonomic working. So those trays ready prior to insertion, watered up if necessary. Simple snips are popular for cutting preparation, and they're ergonomic and efficient to use, but some people prefer to use knives. It just depends on what people are comfortable with and what works best for the material you're handling, really. Important to remove lower leaves, trim those off for a couple of reasons. It aids insertion and reduces the risk of any pathogens developing on leaf stubs, etc., after insertion in the growing media. And a key thing where you've got multiple propagators is to ensure uniformity, not just within what one person is producing, so trays are uniform, but uniformity within the team, so that the batch of stock is nice and even, and that will carry through production. Okay, next slide. So rooting hormones, these are basically plant growth regulators. They're classed as pesticides, so there is some legislation attached to how they should be stored and used, and in particular there are final use dates attached to them, and that can be checked on the HSE pesticide website by typing in the product name. But from a more efficacy point of view, there are important considerations with storing them, particularly say the powders that are commonly used. They want, after you finish using them, they want to be put away, ideally with a lid on the container so they don't get damp and draw moisture in and deteriorate. And it's good to use up the powder in the pots and replenish it with fresh, rather than just keep adding a bit, and it can start to get a little claggy and frowsy, as it were. So they're useful for semi-ripe and hardwood cuttings, particularly where species are known to be difficult to root. I'm sure many of you have got experience of things that you do and don't need to use rooting hormones on. Easy to root things you can generally get away without using them. So don't normally need them for herbaceous or softwood cuttings, but there are a few exceptions. We used to be using products called Ceredics, but those have gone, and they're rise upon products now, and these are ready-to-use powders, as I've just said, or dissolvable tablets that can be the cuttings can be dipped into or sprayed onto the cuttings post insertion. Just if you are using dips, there may be additional considerations about the disposal of those dips post use. So that's just a consideration there. Okay, next slide. So this is just really a summary of the main types that sort of fit most nursery use. So Chrysopon rose is useful for softwood material if you need to use it. Chrysotop green, semi-ripe or ripe, generally used semi-ripe cuttings, and Chrysoplus grey for more of a hardwood cutting that needs some help to root. So that's just a reference point really, that slide. So okay, so propagation media, I've come across a few people, particularly smaller growers, making their own mixes, not just of propagation media but of growing media in general. And the main concern with this is it may not be sterile, so you really want that any mix, but particularly a propagation mix, using one that's free of pest disease and weed seeds, and that's an important consideration. So I just think the question should pop up in the chat. So Andrew's asking an advantage of using wetters. ICL suggests soaking overnight. Is that, I'm not quite sure what you mean by that, Andrew. Is a wetter to, I need a bit more information really. So if you can provide that, I'll try and answer that a bit later. Okay, so back to the propagation media for the time being. Proprietary mixes will be uniform and stable, so they'll consistently be the same. They'll have the same pH range that we need there for non-ericaceous crops. Depending on how long you're keeping the material in plug trays or whatever you're propagating into post-rooting, you might wish to have a controlled release fertilizer added, and that will save you liquid feeding, and there are release patterns that will fit your needs. So again, something to talk to a supplier on. Some of the more difficult species can be rooted into sort of more novel media. So rockwool's proved its use for a couple of difficult species noted there. Proprietary medias are readily available, and they have the correct airfill porosity for the task in hand. So they drain well, but they also retain moisture. So depending on your propagation system, particularly under mist, when it's hot, they can be subjected to quite a lot of moisture and wet. So we need them to drain but retain the moisture to aid that rooting. Okay, next slide. So seed, really here it's best to buy in seed where it's commercially available. It's often more cost effective to buy in young plants as plugs for container production where they are available, rather than buying in that seed and raising your own plugs. And that's because the young plant producers have highly automated systems and they can produce them cost effectively using those, and there'll be a nice even tray ready to go when they arrive with you. If anyone's raising sort of tree and hedging type crops, provenance is very important for planting schemes, and local provenance is always preferred. So that seed of local provenance should be available for all the major species across the UK and Wales really, so that shouldn't be a problem. Some people have expressed an interest in collecting their own seed in the past, but it becomes a challenging area because there are lots of potential dormancy issues, but particularly with seed of woody taxa. So you can get delayed dormancy, sporadic dormancy, And the major suppliers of tree and hedging seed will prime and treat any seed to address these dormancy issues. So as that seed arrives with you, it's ready to go and ready to germinate. So it gets around all those sorts of problems. As a general rule of thumb, minimize the amount of time you store seeds for to maintain their viability. Think of them as little live capsules, and they don't last forever, as I'm sure you're aware. But if you do need to store them, that can be done simply in a fridge, in a sealed box, and that will give you a bit more time. So maybe carry over from season to season. You can get a reduction in seed viability, the amount that germinate or the percentage that germinate over time, but you can normally carry over from one season to the next without too much trouble. Okay, next slide. So different types of cutting. We've got nodal cuttings, which the best way of describing these is, if you're not familiar with the term, is you've got your leaf joints up the stem, so cutting underneath the leaf joint, removing the bottom leaves, and then above the next leaf joint you'll cut, and that's a nodal cutting. Some species, such as Buddleia and Hydrangea, particularly if grown under protection, they can have very long internodes, and that makes for an unwieldy sort of cutting if you're doing a nodal cutting. And you can get away without doing nodal cuttings on some species. So for some species, internodal cuttings are an option, and that again gives you uniformity of your cuttings in your trays when you insert them, because they're all the same size. Heel cuttings can be used for other species, such as Ceanothus, but just talking through this, in some cases with Ceanothus, like using Ceanothus as an example, it would be highly unlikely to do a whole batch of heel cuttings. You'll probably have a mixture of heel cuttings and internodal cuttings within your tray, just to utilise that material that you've got to the best of your advantage. Basal cuttings are also done largely for herbaceous type species such as aster. Also leaf and bud cuttings can be done, camellia and mahonia. And then root cuttings are another method. They're not so widely used these days, but they can produce quite useful numbers of stock from a relatively small amount of material. And with things like phlox that can be prone to leaf and bud nematode, they are only in the leaves. So Japanese anemone is another example. So by doing root cuttings, you can actually clean up infested stock quite nicely using that technique. So that's something to bear in mind. Okay, next slide. So micropropagation is a useful technique to clean up stock with virus. If you've got something that has got virus that you can't get clean stock of, something that's perhaps a bit unique to you or unusual, so that can be sent to a lab to clean it up. Again, if someone's got a particular clone of something that they like and like its habit and growth habit and suits their business, they might choose to put it in micropropagation to clean it up if they know there's a virus in it. It can be used to ensure things like Japanese anemone are free of leaf and bud nematode. It's often a tool for rapid bulking up of new varieties, so you can get massive numbers from a small amount of plant material in a relatively short amount of time. So it's a good tool to bring new things up to the market, but that might be more of a tool for plant breeders. And then if someone's found a spore that they find and want to explore, it's an option. Specialist suppliers often wean micropropagated stock into plugs for you, so they come as plug plants effectively, and that takes some of the risk out of the job depending on your facilities. And it's a useful propagation technique for difficult species. So that's a bit on micropropagation. Okay, next slide. So moving on to budding and grafting. Budding's carried out in the summer, normally on rootstocks planted out in the field. So largely used in tree and rose production. Efficient use of propagating material. And I've just seen a question from Andrew pop up there. Micropropagation expensive to set up? Generally, it's contracted out to specialist labs. There aren't many in the UK, even they're normally overseas, but there's one large nursery in the south of England that's got its own lab, but it's really quite unusual. You need quite expensive equipment, and for most nurseries it's much more cost effective to send things to a lab to have it micropropagated than to think about setting up their own lab, really. So back to budding and grafting. It makes efficient use of propagation material because you just take a bud from the chosen clone and insert that into your rootstock. The rootstock can give a number of benefits. It may have more vigor than the chosen clone, which is what you're budding in. Also, some things don't perform so well on their own roots, so it's a useful way of propagating them. Budding is a bit of a dying art, really. Most nurseries tend to use contract budding teams that travel around the country, coming from France typically. They do the season out there and work around Europe, as it were. So there aren't many nurseries with in-house budding teams. Another method is grafting in winter when dormant with some base heat. And you really want to keep those tops cool till the graft union had developed. So you've got your rootstock and your scion. Your scion is your top material that you're grafting on. They're typically dipped in wax post-grafting to minimize any risk of desiccation, because the risk of desiccation is the risk of death. So we want to avoid that until they've knitted together and formed a good graft union, and that rootstock can support the scion and the two become one, as it were. Hot pipes are used to provide heat at the graft union for some species, particularly those prone to failure. So they're specially constructed benches where there's a sort of hot pipe that the graft union rests on, and the top and the bottom are kept cool, so it enables that graft union to develop whilst not breaking bud and coming into leaf or the roots starting to get active, which they would do if it was much warmer. Okay, next slide. So division, suitable for herbaceous alpine grasses. The main drawback of this propagation method, it really requires large amounts of stock, and it's become a little outdated because of that. So propagation from seeds, cuttings or micropropagation is often more cost effective than traditional sort of division of herbaceous type stock. Where this isn't really an option, material can go further if people make small splits and insert those into a sort of large cell tray and create like a mini liner, if you like, and then take that through the production system. So that's a way of getting the most from the material. It's normally done in late winter or early spring, and then there are a few species that can be done post-flowering, which helps to spread the workload a bit if they're species that you produce. Okay, next slide. So layering is quite an old method. It's very labour intensive. It's useful for difficult or slow species, so Persica is an example. But you've got a big stock plant to maintain. You might get half a dozen or a dozen layers from that stock plant a year. Okay, Persica is quite a high value plant, but it's still not a great return. And you've got the other cultural issues to address, sort of weed controlling in a soil-based system, and it's not as efficient as other systems, but there are a few things that are still done like that. It's been adapted where possible, so there's a system called French layering that's been developed where a whole stem is pegged down for its entire length early in the year, and that's earthed up when young shoots start to appear, so when they're about 5 centimeters tall, and that will continue to be earthed up a couple or 3 times during the growing season, and that's a way of getting more from each layer. So where each shoot forms, you should get roots, so you'll get multiple plants from each stem layered rather than just one, like with traditional layering. Stalling is also known as mound layering, and it's where you earth up in spring to blanch young shoots, which then induces root initiation. And these are pruned away in winter, and it's mainly used for production of maisless rootstocks, so apple rootstocks, which are then lined out in the field and then budded with the chosen cultivar or variety later that year. So mist systems, they're ideal for rooting. They wet the foliage whilst minimising water loss from the cutting, minimising stress, and keeping everything as it should be. They provide evaporative cooling and prevent wilting. But you can still get heat issues, so it's important to shade and ventilate the structure, typically a glass house, to keep the temperature in check. So typical venting temperatures there. Base heat is normally used, but for easy to root subjects, you don't need base heat. It just depends on what you're producing, and that's generally people soon get experience as to if something's a bit difficult and try it a bit with some base heat, and it can produce better results. Okay, next slide. So fog-based systems, they're similar to mist, but they're not so popular. There are various systems across the top there. The benefits really are that larger cuttings can be rooted and taken earlier in the year. It can give you a faster take and a better percentage. They use less water, which is a consideration. They're ideal for weaning micropropagating material because it's a really well supported environment with high humidity, so it enables them to make the transition from a sort of glass jar type environment with high humidity to a more natural humidity, which varies. Controlling temperatures can be difficult in some systems, so ventilated fog addresses that a bit, but they can be quite unpleasant to work in. They're very humid, so they're akin to being in the tropics, really. And in summer, they can be really quite unpleasant to work in. Just a point with both fog and mist systems, there's a tool called an evaposensor being developed, which controls the moisture within these production systems. And they've really pushed the industry on, really. There's been quite a lot of research funded by AHDB on this, and it's something to consider if you've got a mist or fog based system. And just on that note, the AHDB collaborated all the research on propagation some years ago into a propagation guide, so AHDB members can get hold of that from the AHDB, and it's a useful guide. So that's called Hardy Nursery Stock Propagation Guide, and its aim really is to become a propagation Bible. So it's a really good reference. So if you haven't got that and you're propagating, it's well worth getting a copy of that. Okay, next slide. So the other types of systems are typically polythene based systems. So these can either be with a hoop or some sort of frame to support that polythene, or polythene placed directly onto the cuttings. Again, it depends on your species that you're producing. If you've got something that's more prone to botrytis, probably a hoop or frame type system is better. Again, we need to think about the environment as much as possible in there. So in summer, providing some shading with a milky polythene. But then in the winter, we want as much light as possible. So moving to a clear polythene there. And also shading on the glasshouse in summer, and ideally shade screens as well. Base heat is required depending on your species. And fleece is another useful tool to help provide additional summer shade and heat retention in winter. And another technique with fleece that some people have developed is with these types of systems, you can get troubles with condensation forming on the underside of a polythene and dripping onto a crop, which obviously gives a disease risk, because wet foliage equals disease risk, and particularly for botrytis in propagation. So they found that putting fleece under the polythene, particularly on species that are very prone to botrytis, can actually help to reduce the risk of that. So it's quite a useful technique if you haven't tried that one. They're generally cheap. Well, they are cheaper than mist and fog systems, but possibly less suitable for soft cuttings, because it's not quite such a supportive environment. Close attention is required because they're out of sight to a degree, so you do need to have a look under that polythene and see what's going on. So ideally a couple of times a week as a minimum, just to check that things are progressing as they should. You haven't got botrytis, etc., developing, which can develop quite readily under these sorts of systems. Okay, next slide. So that's a round of propagation, really. If anyone would like any more advice, or please post questions, and just flagging up that there is one-to-one ornamentals advisory available through the Tyfu Cymru scheme, which can either be done via Zoom or through one-to-one visits as and when it's safe to do so with the dreaded COVID-19. Okay, next slide. So any further questions? I've just back in the questions, Andrew, and I can't say any more about that ICL and wetters. So whether you want to put a bit more in there to explore that. Wetters are used in growing media, and they help to re-wet them when they get dry and evenly re-wet them. So they are put in proprietary mixes as standard, really. So they will be in those proprietary mixes. Maybe that answers the question.
Very many thanks, David, for a really informative meeting. Does anybody else have any other questions for David?
David, with the wetter, it's H2 Grow, the ICL one, and on the label it suggests that you soak your cuttings overnight before inserting them.
Yeah, okay.
So it's just something I was messing about with and giving a try.
Yeah. And what sort of, you're doing that for all species, are you, Andrew?
No, I just did it. I think I did it for some rosemary, and it's supposed to just help the uptake of water and keep the cuttings more tepid.
Yeah, yeah. And have you found that it helps improve your results, or?
Not really. So I will keep messing about with it, because I always do these.
Yeah, I mean, we did some work through an HDB funded project a few years ago under the Bedding and Pot Plant Centre, and it was looking at treatments on cuttings, and these were cuttings, so they're geranium pelargoniums, and they were imported from somewhere in Africa, I think. So obviously a few days in the supply chain, although they were wrapped and packaged as they should be. But we found that soaking those, I think from memory, even the water soak gave them a boost, because it basically was rehydrating them and getting them back into a good place to root.
Okay. Thank you.
Does anybody else have any questions? So So thank you very much for joining us today. We will be posting this meeting on the Knowledge Hub in the next few days. If Tyfu Cymru can assist you further, please do not hesitate to get in touch with us. And just to let you know, we have an exciting programme of meetings and webinars planned for the next few months, and you can find these details on the What's On page of the website. Just a couple that you may be interested in is taking your email marketing to the next level using MailChimp on January the 15th at 2 p.m. and assisting growers to navigate the planning process will be on January the 27th at 4 p.m. Shortly in the chat box, you'll see a short evaluation form to complete. We'd really appreciate if you could spare a couple of minutes to let us know your thoughts and suggest topics for future webinars. We are busy planning more meetings for the Ornamental Network, and this would be incredibly useful for us. So thank you all once again, and thank you, David, for the presentation.
Callum has just made a good point about checking for pests such as voles, and yet very good point. Also other pests, so you can get pests like two-spotted spider might creep into propagation sometimes if they get on into a material, and I've seen thrips as well. And although they don't thrive in high humidity conditions, they can still build up, so it's well worth keeping your eyes peeled.
Could I just add to that, David, that my experience with voles is they very much like using evergreen cuttings to make nests with, which is quite depressing as a grower. Yeah. Plenty of mouse traps, and some species of voles seem to be easier to catch with raisins, so that's another useful bait.
So thank you once again for joining. If you do have any further questions, please email us and we can forward them on to David. And remember that we can arrange for one-to-ones for you. So many thanks. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.